Have you ever wondered? What if someone tried to steal your legacy, your home, your birthright? This wasn't just a land dispute. It was a battle for honor, justice, and an entire generation's heritage. When wealth and influence stand against the common man, can truth still win? Today, hear the story of how a hidden legacy shook the entire system to its core. HOA nonsense deserves its own record book. They demolished my family's 150-year-old ranch to build an oversized mansion on the lake. No permits, no approval. Karen, the HOA president, acted like it was a grand community upgrade, the ribbon cutting like she was unveiling a national landmark. She thought she'd pulled off the impossible, but there was one thing she didn't count on. That land came with a buried clause signed over a century ago by a man whose portrait still hangs in the county courthouse. And guess who holds the original paperwork? Me. Karen's so-called masterpiece sat on a legal foundation made of sand, and it was the court that helped me walk right through the door she tried to close. This story, it's just getting started. If you're watching this, Karen, leave a comment, because right now, I'm sitting in court while you sob and scream, blaming me for destroying your life. But if we want to know why Karen's crying, we have to rewind 8 months. I'm Ezra Blackwood, the 5th-generation steward of Moonwater Ranch, and this is the story of how I fought back when my family legacy was nearly erased. The HOA's first move came in the form of a pink envelope, cheerful on the outside, deadly on the inside. Inside was a violation notice claiming my chicken coop was out of compliance. But I should have known something was up when I saw Karen outside at sunrise, measuring the structure with a tape and clipboard like she was assessing a crime scene. I'll give her this, she's persistent. Too bad she put her energy in the wrong direction. Let me give you a sense of what they were trying to take. Moonwater Ranch stretches over 15 acres of prime lakefront property. It's been in my family since my grandfather, Josiah Blackwood, a former county judge, laid its first log in 1875. The house is made of hand-hewn timber, full of history and soul. The barn, which I've converted into a woodworking shop, has been in continuous use for 5 generations. I build custom furniture and ship it all across the Pacific Northwest. This place isn't just home, it's history in motion. Karen Pett, however, represents the modern HOA in its worst form. At 45, she used to be an architect designing luxury resorts until the economy tanked. Since losing her job, she's redirected all her energy into her new kingdom, the Clearwater Heights HOA. She treats the neighborhood like it's one of her blueprints, with every resident as a project she needs to fix. And while I get that losing your career hurts, turning that grief into a campaign against my heritage, that's where I draw the line. The list of violations she sent me read like a joke. According to her, my chicken coop disrupted the visual flow of the neighborhood, my hand-built fence wasn't aesthetically compatible, and the sound from my morning woodworking exceeded their designated noise thresholds. Karen had downloaded a decibel app and logged my hammering sessions, complete with GPS and timestamps like I was running some kind of illegal operation. The woman ran surveillance like she thought I was cooking meth in the barn. So I marched over to her house, determined to get to the bottom of this. Her white colonial stood spotless, with flowers that probably matched a spreadsheet somewhere. There she was, sipping coffee on her porch, dressed like she was heading to a corporate boardroom. "Ezra, dear," she called with a saccharine smile, "I was just going over your file, ready to discuss your compliance schedule." Her clipboard was a rainbow of highlighted doom. Pink meant urgent. My whole property. Pink. She flipped through her papers like a lawyer delivering closing arguments. According to the Clearwater Heights Visual Standard Policy, all exterior structures must reflect contemporary design language. While your buildings are, let's say, rustic, they clash with the neighborhood's aesthetic cohesion. That's when I reached into my folder and pulled out the ace, a yellowed document with an embossed county seal. My grandfather had secured a formal exemption for Moonwater Ranch. It was ironclad. Not only had he refused to join the HOA, he'd made sure it was legally documented. Karen's face changed the moment her fingers brushed that letterhead. The confidence in her eyes faded. She placed her mug down with exaggerated care, her voice softening. "Oh, sweetheart," she said slowly, "that exemption only applied to Josiah. When the deed passed to you, so did our jurisdiction." Karen folded her arms and gave me that smug smile again. "When property ownership changes hands, sweetheart, the exemption doesn't carry over. Your grandfather's deal? It died with him." Her voice was condescending, like she was explaining the rules of monopoly to a child. "This land now falls under HOA regulation, and frankly, it's long overdue. That ranch has been a neighborhood eyesore for years." I didn't feel shocked, just stunned that she'd done so much homework. Karen wasn't just a nosy neighbor with too much time. She had researched the law, understood the loopholes, and constructed what seemed like a bulletproof case against my home. But deep down, I could tell this had nothing to do with aesthetics. It was a personal vendetta. The next several days felt like a military operation led by a woman with a clipboard. Every morning at dawn, Karen showed up like clockwork, armed with a measuring wheel, DSLR camera, and her signature pink folder. It felt like my house was a crime scene, and she was the lead detective. She took photos of fence posts from every imaginable angle, labeled them with sticky notes, and checked each measurement against building codes she somehow had memorized. Even sweet old Mrs. Patterson across the street got a citation for hanging out her laundry. Karen called it unsightly visual clutter. I initially tried to comply, thinking I could ride out her obsessive streak. I repainted my front door to the HOA's approved color, muted sage meadow, so bland it made oatmeal seem exciting. I moved my woodworking to the afternoon and bought a dust filter that cost more than my first car. For 2 weeks I played by every rule. Then the second letter showed up. No envelope, no delivery service, just taped to my door with more adhesive than a hurricane shelter. This wasn't some casual complaint. It was printed on heavy cardstock, topped with bright red letters reading "Final Notice." Karen had gone to the county and filed an official request for seizure of my property, claiming that my failure to comply amounted to abandonment. I had 30 days, just 30 days, to conform my century-old ranch into something out of her suburban design fantasy or lose it all. I stood in my grandfather's old woodshop, surrounded by antique tools and the scent of fresh pine, and heard his voice in my head. Sometimes, you have to let them think you've lost. That's when I realized maybe I needed to let Karen feel like she'd won, at least. For now. Karen showed up 3 days later like a queen, ready to claim her land. She wasn't alone. Behind her was a man who looked like he billed $500 an hour and sneezed into silk napkins. Richard Blackstone, in a spotless navy suit, complete with a leather briefcase that probably held more lawsuits than contracts. Trailing behind them was her daughter Jessica, fresh out of college and perpetually unemployed, armed with a ring light and high-end camera gear. This wasn't a friendly HOA visit, this was a staged media event. Jessica immediately started setting up for what she called community documentation, like this was some kind of historic preservation interview. Karen, of course, was dressed to impress in pearls and powder blue, like she was hosting a brunch at the governor's mansion. "Ezra, darling," she chirped with fake charm that made my skin crawl. "This is Richard. He's the legal mind helping our little community improve and grow." She gestured toward my living room like it was already hers. Richard stepped forward with a rehearsed smile and shook my hand like he'd done this dance 100 times before. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, cool and calculated, "I represent the Clearwater Heights Homeowners Association in matters of structural compliance and land use." His voice had the cadence of someone used to getting their and the legal power to back it up. Jessica kept fiddling with her gear, angling the light for her mom's best side. "We'll be streaming this," she said flatly, without even asking. "The neighborhood deserves transparency. Let's see just how cooperative you can be through all this," Karen quipped, with the kind of smugness that made my blood boil. Somehow, she had managed to twist my potential removal from the land I grew up on into a reality show for bored suburbanites scrolling on their lunch breaks. My family's legacy had become her online content. Richard popped open his leather briefcase like he was unveiling treasure, the inside perfectly organized with color-coded tabs clearly matching Karen's obsessive attention to detail. "Mr. Blackwood," he began, carefully laying out documents across my grandfather's handmade oak table. "Today's meeting is about the legal boundaries of eminent domain in relation to neighborhood development." His voice had that fake warmth you hear from people who sell things they don't believe in. He made it sound like taking my home was a favor to society, like I should be thanking them for the honor. Karen couldn't keep her enthusiasm bottled up any longer. With a flourish, she pulled out her tablet and tapped the screen to display a slideshow filled with polished 3D renderings that looked like they were lifted straight from a luxury real estate catalog. "Ezra, sweetheart, I've got to show you what I've been working toward," she said, practically glowing with self-satisfaction. "I've been slowly purchasing the properties around yours for over 2 years now. Yours is the final puzzle piece I need." She flipped through dazzling images of a grand lakefront estate complete with cascading infinity pools, a boutique-style wellness spa, and a dock large enough to fit a yacht. The images had all the elegance and flair of a magazine spread, framed with gold lighting and digital birds flying overhead. Karen wasn't just playing house. She had built a dream and was now ready to bulldoze mine to realize it. "This is about more than bylaws or guidelines," she said, her tone taking on the dreaminess of someone completely in love with their own fantasy. "This is about creating a beacon of elegance, a signature project that makes Clearwater Heights a place of distinction." As she painted her grand vision with words, I could feel the weight of her condescension. She spoke of my family's ranchland passed down through 5 generations, as if it were some quaint little blemish on the canvas of her perfect neighborhood. She dismissed 150 years of tradition and blood, sweat, and tears like it was a barn that needed demolishing for a better view. The way she trivialized everything we had built, everything we had defended, was so casually cruel it took my breath away. And Richard, ever the loyal second in command, simply nodded along, as if she'd laid out a logical argument, instead of a land grab dressed in designer dreams. Every so often, Richard would chime in with polished phrases that sounded vaguely legal buzzwords like community value and property revitalization, but the more he spoke, the more I noticed something wasn't adding up. His explanations were broad, lacking any actual legal citations. When I asked for his state bar number, he immediately began fiddling with his briefcase, like he'd suddenly forgotten how to speak. Bar credentials aren't really the point here. Karen chimed in before he could answer. What matters most is the collective agreement and support from the neighborhood. She painted Richard as a seasoned expert in local planning and development, but the way she dodged my question only raised more doubts about his qualifications. Meanwhile, her daughter Jessica had already gone live in their neighborhood Facebook group narrating what she called a landmark meeting for community enhancement. In just a few minutes, comments started pouring and neighbors I'd known for years were suddenly cheering Karen on and accusing me of being selfish for not agreeing to her plan. The public shaming was fast and brutal. People I'd grilled burgers with on 4th of July weekends were now calling me an obstacle to progress just because I wanted to hold on to what my grandfather built. "We're not trying to bully you," Karen said, her voice coated in fake compassion. "We know this must be hard for you emotionally, but we're doing this for the betterment of everyone. Your grandfather's era is over, it's time to make space for something greater." To her, letting go of my family's land was some kind of noble act, a contribution toward a polished, idealized version of the future she envisioned for Clearwater Heights. As the trio packed up their neatly organized folders and tech equipment, Karen paused at the door, giving me that same practiced smile that always came before a veiled threat. "We'll give you 7 days to reconsider," she said sweetly. "I trust you'll come to the right decision. Everyone here is depending on you." The message was crystal clear: either fall in line or be branded the enemy of the neighborhood. As they made their way back to her spotless luxury SUV, I stood in silence. This wasn't just about land. It was about dominance, control, and desperate attempt to fill the void left by the collapse of her once flourishing career. My name is Ryan Carter, and I live in San Diego, California. I'm the voice behind Loop Stories, sharing moments that reveal the lengths people will go when their egos are on the line. If you think something was missing from this story, or if you've lived through something similar, drop a comment below. I read every one. When Karen assumed she had total control, I came across an aged document that could bring her entire scheme crumbling down. The day after her so-called final offer, I realized I needed more than surface-level answers. Her polished threats and Richard's conveniently vague legal jargon didn't sit right with me. The way everything had lined up felt far too deliberate, like she had orchestrated this whole thing long before anyone else caught on. My grandfather Josiah wasn't just a retired judge with land on the lake, he was a strategist, a man who played the long game and laid safeguards for moments just like this. If anyone could foresee trouble decades in advance, it was him. I headed straight to the county records building, a dull bunker-like place that seemed built for function, not aesthetics. The inside hummed under old fluorescent lights, casting a sterile glow over metal file cabinets filled with over a century's worth of property dealings, legal disputes, and land ownership history. Behind the front desk sat Martha Goldstein, 68 years old and the undisputed guardian of the county's paper trail. Her mind was so sharp and thorough, you'd think she had every file memorized. She looked up from her monitor, and as soon as she recognized me, her whole face lit up. "Ezra Blackwood," she greeted, her eyes twinkling. "Haven't seen you since we buried Josiah." He was one sharp man, clever and shrewd. Her voice carried the warmth of familiarity and a touch of mischief. "What brings you back to my quiet little fortress of forgotten paperwork?" There was something comforting about Martha, like visiting your favorite aunt who always knew when to offer tea and when to let you vent. More importantly, she was the last living person who'd worked side by side with my grandfather on countless land deeds and legal contingencies. I filled her in on everything: the HOA threats, Karen's relentless targeting, and how just supposed exemption from their authority seemed to vanish with his passing. Martha listened patiently, the kind of listener who made you feel heard even when you were rambling. She'd clearly witnessed her fair share of neighborhood feuds and bureaucratic blunders over the decades, yet she gave me her full attention, occasionally offering a knowing nod or quiet hum of agreement. When I finished explaining, she leaned back slowly in her chair, eyes narrowing as if retracing old mental blueprints. It was obvious she knew something. After a long pause, she stood with a surprising amount of energy and resolve. "Your grandfather wasn't just smart," she said with a sly smile. "He used to tell me, Martha, mark my words, one day, someone will come sniffing around trying to steal my grandson's land. When that happens, show him what's in box number 1875. She guided me through a narrow corridor behind the records office until we reached a reinforced steel door with a plaque that read "Restricted Access. Historical Archives." Unlocking it required 2 keys, one in Martha's possession and the other secured in a time-locked safe that only opened during regular office hours. Inside the vault, rows of metal containers stretched across the room, each neatly labeled by year and property zone, preserving the most vital legal documents in the county's history, with emotion as practiced as muscle memory. Martha pulled out a worn brass key and opened box number 1875. Inside, Time-worn documents were wrapped in oil-treated cloth and tied together with a pale blue ribbon that had long since faded. The writing on the pages was done in violet ink that had somehow resisted age, and each sheet carried an official county seal embedded in dark red wax. "This," Martha said gently, unfolding the first paper, "is the original Moonwater land. Grant that legitimized your family's ownership. But what matters most is what comes next." She pointed to a section clearly penned in Josiah's unique script. It was a perpetual heritage clause, a legal provision he had authored and managed to embed into county legislation. This clause didn't just shield the Moonwater Ranch. It laid the groundwork for safeguarding historic landmarks across the region. As Martha went over its legal significance, the fog around Karen's agenda began to lift from beyond. What I saw changed everything. The clause didn't just restrict the HOA from overstepping. It made any commercial redevelopment of historically designated land a direct violation of preservation law. More than that, it carried legal consequences. Anyone caught damaging or demolishing protected property could be forced to pay triple damages and face mandatory landmark designation on the site. Martha then retrieved another document from the box and said, "Your grandfather didn't just defend what he built. He set up a legal structure for future generations, too." She went on to show me court records from past cases where this very clause had been put to the test. In 3 different lawsuits filed by developers, every single one had ended in defeat, with large financial penalties slapped on those who had tried to sidestep the rule. But the most unexpected discovery was a sealed envelope marked only with, "To my grandson, when they come for what's ours." Inside was a letter, and the moment I saw Josiah's handwriting, it felt like he had written it yesterday, watching everything unfold from afar. "Son," the letter read, "if someone ever tries to take what belongs to us, remember the best move isn't always to fight back immediately. Let them think they've won. Let them sink their money, time, and pride into a battle they were never meant to win. Then, when they're too far in to turn back, show them exactly what mistake they've made." Martha helped me create certified copies of everything in that box, giving me concrete legal ammunition strong enough to stand in any court. As we worked, she spoke about Josiah's deep insight, and the way he had predicted the exact kind of greed that would someday knock on my door. "Your grandfather always believed someone would eventually come along who thought money could erase history," she said with a look of both admiration and warning. "He made sure you'd be ready." As I drove home with the documents locked, in the back of my truck, I felt something rare, part resolve, part gratitude. Karen was still deep in her schemes, unaware that every move she made was steering her straight into a legal snare set over a century ago. To her, this was just a feud with a stubborn neighbor. But the truth was, she'd just collided with 150 years of legal foresight. That evening, sitting in my grandfather's old workshop, holding the documents he'd once held, I made a choice I knew he would have respected. I wouldn't confront Karen just yet. I wanted her to keep going. I wanted her to double down, spend more money, announce her victory, and sell her fantasy to the neighborhood. Let her stage her little triumph in front of everyone, make her believe she'd won. Then, when she'd fully committed and had no graceful exit left, I'd reveal the legacy she never saw coming. Karen had sent invitations across town for what she called the official teardown of my house. I showed up too, with a single envelope in hand, one she'd wished she'd never opened. 2 weeks after I unearthed my grandfather's hidden weapon, Karen threw her grand ceremony with all the pomp of a political event. She turned my front lawn into something out of a red carpet. Gayla, she turned my front lawn into something straight out of a luxury resort brochure. An oversized white canopy strung with LED lights, seating for over 100, and gourmet catering stations offering flutes of champagne and hors d'oeuvres that probably cost more than most people's rent. Karen made an entrance like a celebrity, dressed in an all-white couture gown and glimmering diamonds that sparkled with every camera flash. This wasn't just the start of a building project. This was her self-appointed crowning moment as Clearwater Heights property queen. Every guest seemed to come with political intent or social advantage. Mayor Bill Henderson arrived with his signature vote-chasing grin, clearly hoping to win points with wealthy voters. A reporter from the Clearwater Daily News trailed behind the crowd, treating the entire affair like it was some noble civic event, not a land grab wrapped in gold ribbon. More than 80 neighbors were present, waving the glossy invites Karen had slipped into their mailboxes herself. Watching it unfold felt like witnessing a parade for a crime scene, just with better lighting and catering. Then came the main attraction. Karen, beaming with theatrical flair, revealed her surprise guest, a TV producer from a high-end renovation show called Luxury Home Transformation. The man, all slick hair and tailored slacks, brought along a full film crew. According to the signage plastered around the venue, this build was slated to be the highlight of their upcoming season, showcasing dreamers who reshape communities. Multiple camera rigs were set up to capture her moment of triumph. Karen took center stage like she was hosting an awards show. She spoke for 15 full minutes with the confidence of someone pitching a utopia, using buzzwords like elegance, and visionary design to sell her project like it was a charity effort. The crowd responded with polite applause as she described the lap pools, guest suites, and a personal marina capable of docking multi-million-dollar yachts. She skillfully left out the part where she strong-armed the land from a family that had lived there for generations. When it came time to cut the ceremonial ribbon, an ornate fabric strip that looked imported and needlessly extravagant, Karen used golden scissors engraved with her initials. Cameras clicked as she smiled wide, as if she were launching a children's hospital rather than breaking ground on land that wasn't legally hers. And all the while, I stood silently, feeling the weight of the manila envelope tucked inside my jacket. The moment finally came. Karen hoisted a decorative gold shovel and posed like she was christening a new era. Phones rose, live streams started, and social media buzzed with hashtags like #DreamHomeLaunch and #ClearwaterMakeover. As she dug the ceremonial first scoop of dirt, she called it, the day Clearwater Heights stepped into greatness. That was when I made my move. I stepped forward. A path opened as people turned to see me approach the stage. Karen's confident smile wavered when she saw my face. I calmly asked to say a few words. After a long pause and a stiff nod, she handed me the mic with a smile so forced it looked like it hurt. "If I may," I began, my voice steady through the PA system, "there's something important the media and all of you should know before this ceremony continues." The shift in mood was instant. People fell silent. Phones stopped filming. Even the waiters froze mid-pour. I reached into my coat, pulled out the envelope, and began explaining in plain language that the land we were standing on was legally protected as a historic site under a clause enacted 150 years ago. Karen's entire operation wasn't just unethical, it was explicitly illegal under county preservation statutes. Her reaction was a mix of fury and fear, dressed up in outrage. She snatched the mic back, yelling that I was fabricating documents and using loopholes to sabotage her dream. But when I held up the certified copies, embossed with the county's seal, and calmly offered to let anyone verify their authenticity as soon as I offered to let people inspect the documents, Karen's polished composure began to unravel in front of everyone. The mayor wasted no time pulling out his phone, immediately calling the county clerk to confirm whether the heritage restriction was genuine. Meanwhile, the local reporter dropped the friendly tone and started firing questions at Karen about her due diligence and legal process. The TV producer, clearly sensing a shift, snapped into damage control, directing his crew to ditch the dream home angle and focus instead on what he now framed as a community controversy spiraling out of control. It was poetic justice. Karen had assembled the cameras to immortalize her supposed win, and now they were filming her public unraveling in crisp HD. But she wasn't ready to walk away from her fantasy just yet. With a loud emotional outburst, she dropped to the ground and started digging furiously at the soil, insisting that her years of planning couldn't be undone by a few dusty old papers. It was one of the most bizarre sights I've ever seen. Her pristine designer dress now stained with dirt, her hair wild, her hands clawing at the earth as if brute force alone could summon her mansion into reality. The entire scene was broadcast live, and viewers across multiple platforms watched in real time as Karen lost control. Her breakdown wasn't just dramatic, it was viral. Within the hour, clips were trending everywhere. Roughly 20 minutes later, the sheriff showed up, calm but firm, and politely escorted her off the property. Her guests shuffled away quietly, avoiding eye contact like people trying to pretend they hadn't just watched someone fall apart in public. The production crew packed up their gear quickly, clearly thrilled with the unexpected goldmine of footage they now had. As her luxury car disappeared down the street, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of relief and anticipation. I knew deep down this wasn't the end. A person like Karen, driven, wealthy, and obsessed with image, wasn't going to vanish quietly just because her party turned into a disaster. And sure enough, after 2 weeks of total silence, she returned. This time, she wasn't alone. She brought legal firepower. It was a calculated move. She'd gone dark, just long enough for the embarrassment to die down before re-entering the scene with reinforcements. By the time she showed up again, the video of her meltdown had been seen over 2 million times. The internet wasn't kind. Comments ranged from mocking disbelief to suggestions that she just quit while she still had any dignity left. But Karen didn't believe in quitting. She knocked on my door with the kind of poise that made it clear she'd regrouped, rearmed, and reimagined her strategy. This time, her backup was Jonathan Pierce, a veteran attorney in his mid-50s, known for handling complex land disputes and intimidating local officials with little more than a letterhead. Jonathan Pierce arrived in a sleek black S-Class Mercedes, carrying a designer briefcase that probably had its own insurance policy. His name carried serious weight in legal circles across the Pacific Northwest, the kind of presence that caused even seasoned judges to check their rulings twice and gave opposing attorneys heartburn. With over 250 courtroom victories involving high-stakes property battles, his resume looked more like a bulldozer's path through heritage districts. His client list was a who's who of developers who saw zoning laws as mere suggestions and historical neighborhoods as prime real estate. Mr. Blackwood, Pierce began smoothly, his tone exuding the calm assurance of someone who rarely loses. I'm representing Ms. Petton in what appears to be a case where outdated legal language is obstructing modern development rights. Let's see if we can resolve this civilly for everyone's benefit. From the way he spoke, it was clear. He wasn't here to bluff or posture like Richard had. This man was the real deal. And the glint in his eye said he already had a strategy mapped out to dismantle my grandfather's careful legal framework. Karen, too, had gone through a complete brand overhaul since the day she melted down with a shovel. The neighborhood power mom vibe was gone. In its place was a carefully crafted persona meant to invoke trust and professionalism, a navy blue blazer, tortoise-shell glasses she didn't need, and a stiff leather folder filled with documents that looked like museum archives. Her rebrand was designed to erase the memory of her viral tantrum and cast her, instead, as a refined protector of community values and architectural history. Pierce didn't waste time getting into the technical weeds. His opening salvo, the Heritage Clause, in his opinion, violated basic constitutional principles by placing unjustified, endless restrictions on how private land could be used. He referred to my grandfather's 1875 legal agreement as a legal relic, a product of a pre-statehood territorial system that, in his words, no longer held enforceable authority under modern federal land use regulations. According to Pierce, such historic agreements must undergo updated constitutional review if they affect current ownership rights indefinitely. What shocked me most, though, wasn't his legal argument, it was the unveiling of Karen's newest role. She now presented herself not as a developer, not as an HOA president, but as the founder of the freshly formed Clearwater Heritage Foundation. Out of nowhere, Karen was now the founder of the so-called Clearwater Heritage Foundation, a freshly minted organization that somehow already had branded letterheads, a professional-looking website, and enough polished materials to make her appear like a seasoned preservation expert. Their mission statement claimed she was committed to transforming historic spaces into hubs for education and culture. The lakefront estate, once her dream home, had magically become a living history museum where modern comforts would support a full-time resident acting as a 19th-century ranch interpreter. Pierce picked up the narrative from there, positioning Karen's new plan as an inventive solution to a common issue: the deterioration of old landmarks through neglect. In his words, she wasn't destroying the past, she was reviving it. Her substantial personal investment, he argued, was aimed at saving local history and making it accessible to the public for generations. I had to admit, they'd done their homework. Karen's blatant attempt at gentrification had been coated in enough cultural sugar to make it difficult for a judge to immediately reject. It didn't stop at just arguments and pretty brochures. Pierce had already taken legal action, submitting a request to the Superior Court to reevaluate the validity of my grandfather's preservation clause under constitutional law. At the same time, he filed a civil complaint against me, claiming I'd intentionally sabotaged what he framed as a legitimate construction project. He wanted $800,000 in damages and a legal injunction barring me from interfering again. According to the filing, I was weaponizing outdated legal language to block Karen from exercising her legal ownership rights. Karen wasn't just fighting in court, she was battling for hearts and minds. 2. She brought in a polished crisis communications firm, the kind that specialized in flipping the script on controversial building projects. Almost overnight, the local news shifted tone. Headlines praised a bold heritage effort that promised to spark cultural tourism and boost the Clearwater Heights economy. She'd taken control of the story, transforming her image from overbearing neighborhood villain to forward-thinking preservationist. The online chatter and community sentiment flipped almost instantly. What used to be whispered concerns about Karen stealing someone's family land had been drowned out by praise for her visionary contribution to local heritage, on how private land could be used. He referred to my grandfather's 1875 legal agreement as a legal relic product of a pre-statehood territorial system that, in his words, no longer held enforceable authority under modern federal land use regulations. According to Pierce, such historic agreements must undergo updated constitutional review if they affect current ownership rights indefinitely. What shocked me most, though, wasn't his legal argument, was the unveiling of Karen's newest role. She now presented herself not as a developer, not as an HOA president, but as the founder of the freshly formed Clearwater Heritage Foundation. Out of nowhere, Karen was now the founder of the so-called Clearwater Heritage Foundation, a freshly minted organization that somehow already had branded letterheads, a professional-looking website, and enough polished materials to make her appear like a seasoned preservation expert. Their mission statement claimed she was committed to transforming historic spaces into hubs for education and culture. The lakefront estate, once her dream home, had magically become a living history museum where modern comforts would support a full-time resident acting as a 19th-century ranch interpreter. Pierce picked up the narrative from there, positioning Karen's new plan as an inventive solution to a common issue: the deterioration of old landmarks through neglect. In his words, she wasn't destroying the past, she was reviving it. Her substantial personal investment, he argued, was aimed at saving local history and making it accessible to the public for generations. I had to admit, they'd done their homework. Karen's blatant attempt at gentrification had been coated in enough cultural sugar to make it difficult for a judge to immediately reject. It didn't stop at just arguments and pretty brochures. Pierce had already taken legal action, submitting a request to the Superior Court to reevaluate the validity of my grandfather's preservation clause under constitutional law. At the same time, he filed a civil complaint against me, claiming I'd intentionally sabotaged what he framed as a legitimate construction project. He wanted $800,000 in damages and a legal injunction barring me from interfering again. According to the filing, I was weaponizing outdated legal language to block Karen from exercising her legal ownership rights. Karen wasn't just fighting in court, she was battling for hearts and minds. 2. She brought in a polished crisis communications firm, the kind that specialized in flipping the script on controversial building projects. Almost overnight, the local news shifted tone. Headlines praised a bold heritage effort that promised to spark cultural tourism and boost the Clearwater Heights economy. She'd taken control of the story, transforming her image from overbearing neighborhood villain to forward-thinking preservationist. The online chatter and community sentiment flipped almost instantly. What used to be whispered concerns about Karen stealing someone's family land had been drowned out by praise for her visionary contribution to local heritage. Karen's media team had gone full throttle. They launched a petition campaign that quickly racked up over 500 names in support of what they now called the Clearwater Heritage Museum. A few city council members even released public statements praising her so-called dedication to cultural preservation and neighborhood enrichment. Folks who'd once mocked her viral breakdown were now applauding her as a trailblazing reformer unfairly blocked by stubborn landowners who just didn't get the big picture. But while Karen was working the headlines, I'd been working the paper trail. During her absence, Martha and I had spent hours combing through old legal archives, and what we unearthed made Pierce's arguments seem more like superficial cracks than actual threats. It turned out my grandfather had built something far more intricate than just a land deed. He'd laid the foundation for a comprehensive legal defense system that foresaw precisely this type of corporate legal siege. The real shocker came when we linked Pierce's firm to a shell corporation called Clearwater Resort Development Corporation, an entity that had been steadily snatching up lakeside land under the radar. Their real objective wasn't just Karen's estate. They were orchestrating a quiet land sweep with intentions to reshape the region into a luxury retreat for the ultra-wealthy. Pierce wasn't just defending one client, he was carefully testing the legal system to dismantle heritage protections for big development profits. Karen's project, it turned out, wasn't an end goal, it was a trial balloon. If Pierce could successfully discredit the legal foundation of my family's clause, he'd create a ripple effect that allowed larger resorts to bulldoze through similar protections statewide. What I was facing wasn't a quirky neighbor with delusions of grandeur, it was the opening move in a regional real estate war aimed at rewriting property laws in favor of profit. But Martha had saved the best revelation for last. Tucked away in a lesser-used cabinet was a folder of correspondence between Josiah and several state-level officials. These letters exposed just how deep my grandfather's planning went. Not only had he crafted protection for Moonwater Ranch, he'd quietly lobbied the legislature to pass an auxiliary safeguard, a legal trapdoor that would slam shut if anyone ever tried to gut the original protections through legal ambiguity. The key piece of that safeguard was something I'd never heard of: the Statewide Heritage Protection Compact of 1876. It had been ratified long ago but never repealed, meaning it was still active and enforceable under today's preservation laws. With that revelation, it became crystal clear Pierce wasn't just walking into a courtroom battle. He was about to step on a legal landmine designed more than a century ago. As he and Karen gathered up their binders and fancy folders, they had no idea the storm they were walking into. As I sifted through their legal arguments and supporting documents, it became obvious they were making the same critical mistake Karen had made during her HOA crusade. They were zeroed in on the technicalities of this case, completely blind to the broader legal web my grandfather had built generations ago. To them, this was a simple case about an old document standing in the way of new development. What they didn't realize was that they were stepping into a legal fortress nearly a century and a half in the making, one that had ties reaching up to the state's highest preservation authorities. Karen had walked into court thinking she'd secured the sharpest legal mind in the county. What she didn't expect was that I'd bring someone who operated on a whole different playing field, someone even Pierce would think twice about crossing. The 3-hour drive to Olympia was long and filled with uncertainty, but when I finally sat across from Charles Montgomery, I knew the journey had been worth every second. The retired governor, now nearing 90, resided in a stunningly preserved Victorian home that doubled as a living archive of Washington's political and legal legacy. Despite his age, Montgomery's intellect was as keen as ever. When I mentioned my grandfather, Judge Josiah Blackwood, he broke into a knowing smile, the kind shared between men who once fought the same battles. "Your grandfather didn't just draft policies, he shaped history," he said, lowering himself into a leather chair that seemed to hum with stories. "We didn't merely protect property. We laid the legal groundwork to defend heritage for centuries." He explained that the 1876 Heritage Protection Compact wasn't just an old law collecting dust, it was the legal backbone of the state's entire historic preservation framework. What Montgomery revealed next completely reframed everything. The compact had established not just oversight, but a specific executive office dedicated to defending sites registered before 1900, and Montgomery still held that role. As the state heritage executive, a rarely invoked but still legally active title, he had the constitutional authority to override court rulings if they posed a threat to historically protected properties. "I'm still empowered by the Constitution to intervene when the preservation of our past is at risk," he said calmly. "And your friend Karen has no clue what she's up against." By the time the court hearing rolled around, the courtroom was brimming with spectators, reporters, townspeople, and legal analysts, all vying for a glimpse of what promised to be a landmark case. Karen entered like she was walking into a press conference, not a courtroom, wearing a tailored Chanel suit and makeup so flawless it looked like she'd stepped off a magazine cover. But what she didn't know was that behind my quiet demeanor and weathered file folder was a force much older, stronger, and better prepared than anything she or her elite attorney had brought to the table. Seated confidently beside Pierce, Karen wore the self-assured look of someone convinced the verdict was already in her favor. Their side came fully armed, detailed scale models of the proposed site, financial projections, and a lineup of experts ready to speak on the educational merits of her so-called museum project. Pierce appeared more like a federal prosecutor than a local attorney, surrounded by color-coded files, multiple briefcases, and a support staff that worked with the precision of a legal machine. Across the aisle, I sat quietly beside my assigned public attorney and a quiet, elderly gentleman whose identity was unknown to the entire courtroom. That man was Charles Montgomery. Dressed in an understated black suit and carrying only a modest leather folder, he radiated a calm authority that outshone any designer briefcase. The imbalance and spectacle was intentional. Karen and Pierce had brought a show. We brought substance built on centuries of law. Pierce opened with a presentation that could have passed for a keynote at a legal symposium. For nearly an hour, he laid out his argument that the Perpetual Heritage Clause unlawfully restricted private development and conflicted with both current zoning policies and federal property rights laws. His slideshow was exhaustive, spanning hundreds of slides with citations, case law, and community development data, all painting the heritage protection as an outdated blockade against modern progress. His strategy hinged on portraying Karen not as a developer, but as a civic-minded innovator, unjustly burdened by obsolete laws. He made her appear as a public benefactor, not a land grabber. When Karen took the stand, she delivered her testimony like a TED Talk. She spoke confidently about her academic credentials and long-standing passion for preserving history. She walked the court through her museum blueprint, highlighting its potential as a cultural center that could engage school children, history lovers, and tourists alike. Her team distributed brochures showing building designs, sample educational programs, and glowing endorsements from local entrepreneurs and community figures. She painted a picture of transformation, one in which her development would enrich not only the neighborhood, but the entire county. It was, without question, a well-executed performance. Around the room, I could see heads nodding and murmurs of approval. The story she told was polished and persuasive. She was casting herself as a protector of history rather than its eraser. By the time Pierce wrapped up, he did so with confidence, requesting $800,000 in damages for what he claimed was my malicious interference in a legitimate development project. He wanted compensation, legal validation, and a restraining order, all delivered with the air of someone convinced the court had no choice but to agree. As soon as Pierce wrapped up with his demand for immediate construction permits, the room filled with murmurs. Clearly, many thought he'd delivered a convincing blow. That's when my court-appointed attorney finally stood, having remained silent up until that point. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "we respectfully request the court hear testimony from a witness whose knowledge of state legal history is directly relevant to these proceedings." The energy in the room shifted palpably as Charles Montgomery made his way to the stand. When he introduced himself as a former governor and the current executive officer of the state's Historical Preservation Authority, you could practically see the judge's posture straighten. What was once a routine civil hearing suddenly felt like something far more significant. Pierce's self-assured facade cracked for the first time as he realized the game had changed dramatically. Montgomery's delivery was measured, but each word struck like a hammer. He laid out how the 1876 Heritage Protection Compact gave him legal authority to designate any property built before 1900 as a protected state landmark, and that, as of yesterday, Moonwater Ranch had officially been granted that protection. The revelation landed like a thunderclap. But Montgomery wasn't done. He went on to explain that Karen's conduct violated multiple state statutes regarding fraudulent representation in historical preservation matters. Then came the real bombshell. Pierce's firm was currently under federal investigation by the FBI for potential racketeering charges linked to unlawful development schemes, targeting heritage sites across the Pacific Northwest. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Whispers gave way to gasps, as Montgomery described how Karen's so-called foundation was part of a wider pattern of fraudulent nonprofit fronts used to greenlight illegal commercial projects under the guise of historical development. Karen's face turned pale as marble, while Montgomery detailed how her misleading claims and fabricated credentials could land her not just in civil court but in criminal proceedings. The judge didn't even ask for a recess. Her ruling was immediate and absolute. The entire suit was thrown out. Karen was ordered to pay $150,000 in penalties and legal costs, barred from coming within 500 feet of Moonwater Ranch for 5 years, and Pierce was formally referred to the state bar for an urgent ethics review. As the judge's gavel struck, finalizing the ruling, Karen collapsed into Pierce's arms with a dramatic cry that echoed through the chamber. "That ranch has ruined my life." She sobbed the exact words I'd predicted back when this entire war began. It was poetic, it was justice, and it was far from over. The cameras didn't miss a second of her public unraveling. Outside the courthouse, media crews scrambled to catch Montgomery's brief but powerful remarks about State Preservation Authority and the pending federal probes. Meanwhile, Karen was hustled into a black SUV, barely able to hold herself together, while Pierce fumbled through questions, clearly shaken by the FBI's involvement. Watching them retreat felt like more than a personal victory. It was a stand taken on behalf of every historical landmark threatened by unchecked development. Half a year passed quietly. I assumed Karen had vanished into legal obscurity until she reappeared on my front porch, wearing a smile that felt more like a threat than a greeting, and holding a bouquet that practically screamed, "I'm not done yet." Moonwater Ranch had become everything I hoped and more. What started as a legacy project had blossomed into a living museum. We now hosted monthly tour groups, often exceeding 200 guests, many traveling from cities like Portland or Seattle, just to experience frontier life firsthand. Families watched blacksmithing demos and took part in heritage woodworking classes. The Tourism Bureau even named us one of the state's top destinations. And my own business, crafting custom historical furniture, had evolved into a small training institute for aspiring artisans across the region. The vision my grandfather once held wasn't just being honored, it was thriving, educating, and sustaining itself without compromising its roots. As for Karen, her world had come apart, piece by piece. She lost her HOA position within weeks of the courtroom disaster, followed by a fire sale of her luxury home to cover her mounting legal debts. Last I'd heard, she was renting a cramped downtown unit with a broken elevator and a leaky ceiling. Pierce hadn't fared much better. His license to practice law was revoked after a slew of ethical violations came to light, and his once powerful firm crumbled as the federal investigation deepened. The so-called Clearwater Heritage Foundation, fully debunked. Not only was it fined into oblivion, but Karen received a permanent legal ban from starting or managing any charitable group in the entire state. So when I opened my front door on that quiet Saturday afternoon and saw her standing there wearing a pastel sundress, cardigan, and an unnervingly bright grin, I knew something wasn't right. She looked like she'd just walked off the pages of a lifestyle. Cataloged in her arms was a massive floral arrangement I'd bet cost more than a full week of groceries. Her voice dripped with exaggerated politeness, but every word felt sharpened beneath the surface. "Ezra, darling," she said, like we were old friends reconnecting over tea. But I'd learned long ago Corinne Patton never just shows up without a plan. She smiled, but the warmth never reached her eyes. "Ezra," she said softly, "I just wanted to say I'm truly sorry for everything. Looking back, I see now that I was wrong to fight against your family's legacy. I'd love the chance to help you preserve it moving forward." Her delivery felt rehearsed to polished, too precise, like she'd gone over the lines in front of a mirror more times than she'd care to admit. She kept steering the conversation toward topics that raised red flags, asking about when I opened the gates for visitors, what parts of the ranch had cameras, and how I stored certain heirlooms. While pretending to admire random decor, she subtly snapped photos when she thought I wasn't paying attention. At first glance, it looked like she was taking casual pictures for sentimental reasons, but the pattern was obvious. She paid particular attention to the framed blueprints mounted in my workshop and any papers lying on my desk that looked remotely officialist, especially insurance forms. The questions she asked weren't those of a curious guest. They were calculated, probing inquiries, clearly designed to assess where my assets were and how secure they might be. Her fake friendliness masked an intent that was anything but innocent. It wasn't until I caught the subtle reflection of a lens glinting from inside her handbag that the full picture clicked. Karen had been live streaming the entire visit. On her Instagram feed, the stream was titled, "Face to Face with the Man Who Ruined My Life, No Filter." It was painfully obvious what she was trying to do. Her goal was to get a soundbite, something out of context that could be twisted, clipped, and turned into viral content. She wasn't here to make peace. She was auditioning for her next social media comeback. And if provoking me on camera didn't work, it seemed she had a backup plan. Maybe stage an accident, break something expensive, and spin it into another legal dispute or insurance nightmare. But I had prepared for this exact moment. Charles Montgomery had warned me weeks earlier that she'd been sniffing around against lawyers about filing claims of wrongful persecution and laying the groundwork for a comeback narrative. I'd notified the sheriff's department about the potential violation of her restraining order and had upgraded my home surveillance to record everything. Every camera on the ranch was live, and every genuinely valuable relic had already been moved to climate-controlled preservation at the regional museum. The items in my house now were indistinguishable replicas, historically accurate, but completely devoid of financial worth. So, when Karen accidentally spilled her overpriced latte onto an old writing desk, then gasped dramatically for her live stream about damaging a priceless antique, I couldn't help but smile. I handed her a roll of paper towels with an even tone and said, "It's okay, Karen, that desk's not worth more than your coffee." I handed her a few paper towels and said casually, "No worries, Karen, that piece. I built it last spring. The originals are all secured at the county museum, where they're properly protected." Her carefully choreographed setup unraveled in seconds. Within moments, the comments on her live stream turned against her, flooding in with remarks like, "This is just sad," and "Girl, let it go already." What she expected to be a dramatic viral moment had become an embarrassing display that only highlighted how far she'd fallen. The smile vanished, and so did the act. She dropped the friendly facade and, without skipping a beat, pivoted into full meltdown mode on camera. Yelling directly into her phone, she accused me of ruining her life, destroying her good name, and sabotaging everything she'd worked for. But the crowd she hoped would rally behind her offered no such support. The comments were blunt and unsympathetic. "Please get help. You're embarrassing yourself, and nobody's stopping you but you." Instead of turning herself into a sympathetic character, she looked unstable and lost. Then came the knock at the door. Deputy Martinez, right on cue. I'd hit the silent alert as soon as Karen crossed onto the porch. Her face drained when she realized what was happening. She was standing on protected state heritage grounds, in violation of a legally binding restraining order, with both my surveillance system and her own livestream capturing everything. Her voice trailed off as her phone finally died mid-rant, cutting her off mid-sentence while she desperately tried to justify her actions. What followed could have been written for a tragic comedy. Karen was led down the steps by the deputy, still fumbling with her dead phone, whispering about content she couldn't recover and chances she'd blown. Her last live stream ended with fewer than 30 viewers, most of whom left messages urging her to seek mental health support and let go of a feud that clearly wasn't going anywhere. She wasn't feared or admired anymore, just pitied. A year passed, and the final chapter practically wrote itself. Moonwater Ranch was formally recognized as a National Heritage Landmark, complete with an official bronze marker detailing its importance in the Pacific Northwest's historical narrative. My furniture program had grown into something much bigger than I'd ever imagined, welcoming more than 50 students each year, and the documentary The Heritage Wars ended up winning a regional Emmy. All profits went toward preserving the ranch and funding educational workshops. And, as a cherry on top, Martha Goldstein was honored with the title of State Archivist Emeritus, a well-deserved tribute to her lifetime of dedication in protecting and preserving Washington's most important historical records. She stood beaming beside the plaque during the unveiling ceremony, her hand resting proudly on the carved cedar podium I'd made just for her. Karen, meanwhile, had vanished from the public eye, her story buried in the past, right where it belonged. Karen eventually left the state. After being hit with multiple restraining orders related to repeated harassment complaints, the last trace of her online activity showed her attempting a bizarre comeback as a wellness guru, with fewer than 50 followers, most of whom looked suspiciously like spam accounts. The woman who once ruled over HOA boards and drafted grand real estate schemes was now uploading generic motivational quotes into the void, chasing engagement that never came. As I stood alongside Charles Montgomery and Martha Goldstein beneath the Moonwater Ranch archway for the official Heritage Landmark recognition, I couldn't help but think how far this journey had taken us. Montgomery placed the Preservation Award in my hands with a kind smile that carried the weight of legacy and quiet victory. "Josiah would be beaming with pride right now," Martha added, her tone warm and seasoned, like someone who had spent a lifetime watching history quietly shape itself. I turned to the documentary team and delivered my final words straight into the lens. "My grandfather believed that protecting what you love sometimes means letting the enemy believe they've already won." Karen thought she'd dismantled my family's legacy. Instead, she became the reason it would endure forever. It's funny how those who try to break you sometimes give you the very tools to make yourself unbreakable. And that's how a woman who tried to erase a century and a half of legacy accidentally helped cement it as a piece of national history. Her scheming, her arrogance, it all backfired. She didn't just lose the ranch fight, she made sure the whole country knew how much it mattered. We've all encountered someone like Karen, the neighbor who believes your fence is their property line, the supervisor who throws their title around like a weapon, The power chasers who think influence outweighs fairness. You've likely felt that burning frustration, wondering if the system will ever favor what's right over what's loud. But here's the truth I've come to accept, and it's backed by every battle I've fought and every document I've studied. The people who stay quiet, who study the rules, who build their case, those are the ones who come out on top. It's not about shouting the loudest. It's about knowing what's yours and defending it smartly. Your home, your legacy, your peace. They're worth guarding with strategy, not rage. If this story reminded you that even the toughest bullies can be beaten with brains over brawn, give it a thumbs up and stay connected with us here at Loop Stories. Thank you for being part of this journey with Loop Stories. A lot of folks laugh off HOA battles like they're petty neighborhood scuffles, but they can shake the foundations of entire communities. We bring you these real-life stories to prove a simple point. Titles and authority don't mean a thing if they're not backed by truth, and if you've ever stood alone against something that felt unjust, know this: you're not the only one. Drop a comment, share your story, and join the growing movement. Together, we take back control. Truth, one story at a time.